I always have a lot of fun doing research on my novels. With Broken Monsters, I went to Detroit. With The Shiny Girls, I went to Chicago. And I also get to interview a lot of really interesting people. But what I love as an extrovert is being able to meet with people and get them to show me their perspective on a city or a place and kind of dig deep into that local knowledge. So I met all kinds of interesting people. In Salt Lake City, I hung out with an ex-Mormon, Ashley Simon, who was just absolutely wonderful. She took me on what she called the Exmo tour of Salt Lake City, which is almost verbatim in the book. And we toured all these crazy sites, including this really weird temple. It was shaped like a pyramid. And she said that back in her, like when she was growing up, her brothers used to shield her eyes when they were driving past because there was a sign which said, "Come and masturbate with us." It was a pretty weird, kinky time, I guess. So it's really interesting to get those individual perspectives. When I landed in Atlanta, my friend Damien Wolven and his girlfriend Kristen Brown showed me around. We went to all these interesting places. I also met a really cool Uber driver who I paid to drive me around for the day. Her name was Anya. She was so great. And she took me around to kind of like lots of movie sites, weird and interesting local places. And at the end of the day, we went on my insistence to a place that I'd heard about called the Claremont. And the Claremont is a pretty infamous strip club. It's actually a retired strippers club. So women who are kind of older, who are no longer stripping, get to come and perform there. And it was a really strange and very moving place to go. We did go to a performance. We tipped like crazy, obviously, support sex workers. And it directly inspired a scene later in the book at a club I call Barbarella's, which caters to an all-female clientele. There aren't so many retired strippers, although it's run by a retired stripper. But there are a lot of drag kings and a lot of women catering to female desire and sexuality. And that was a really interesting thing to think about. What would a strip club that only catered to female clientele look like? And I guess that ties into a lot of interesting questions which came up about this book, about how a world of women would be different. It's not necessarily going to be a nicer place. Yes, we'll be able to go walking at night. Yes, you won't fear violence at the hands of men. But it's not exactly going to be all kumbaya and friendship bracelets and communal gardening. When I was back in South Africa, I went and hung out with the Cape Town Metro Police for an assignment that I was doing. And I kind of live tweeted the ride along. It was really interesting hanging out with these cops. We went into like really, really dangerous areas. We met some gang leaders, including the gang leader of the Americans, which is a notorious Cape Town gang. They're not the worst gang. The worst gang in Cape Town is the Mongrels, but the Americans have like a bad reputation. And I asked the detectives that I was hanging out with, I said, well, what would happen if all the men disappeared tomorrow? You know, what would happen with crime and gangsterism and drug addicts and social problems? And they laughed and they rolled their eyes and they're like, well, none of that would go away. You know, addicts will still be addicts. The crime and the desperation and the need will still be there. And they said that actually the worst leader of the Americans was Mama American. And because she was a woman, she had more to prove. She was more ruthless, she was more violent, and she put a lot more on the line. And actually the gang calmed down a lot after she appointed her son-in-law to take over. So that was a really interesting perspective, and I really wanted to play with that. And that came out of these interesting conversations. So I spoke to a lot of different people. I spoke to economists, I spoke to geneticists and people who deal with epidemics, trying to figure out how this virus would work, how society would change. And what was really interesting, talking about kind of designing this virus that would kill everyone with a prostate. So it's not just men, it's also trans women, unfortunately. The virus in the book is not a main part of the story. Most of the story happens in the aftermath. But it does decimate about 3.5 billion people. It's an oncovirus, which is a fancy word for a cancer-causing virus. And the classic example of that is HPV, which is a STI, which then can turn into cervical cancer. So in the book, my virus presents as flu. It's very contagious, and then it causes very aggressive, very fast-acting prostate cancer in boys and men and anyone with a prostate. It takes out like almost all the male population within a matter of 3 months. And it's a devastating time. People run out of painkillers. We lose our fathers and our best friends and our brothers and our sons. it's really tragic. So what was interesting was talking to people about how that might work. And I had really fun, interesting conversations, which maybe are not so fun and interesting now that we're all living with a real virus. But it was really cool to have those conversations, to tap into really interesting brains. And interestingly, a lot of the people I spoke to were women. These badass female scientists I happen to know, like Dr. Bridget Calder, Dr. Haley Tomei, Dr. Janine Schofield, Dr. Kerry Gordon, and it was interesting to kind of get this kind of reflection of what a world without men would look like from my cool female scientist friends. When I arrived in Miami, I connected really well with my Airbnb hosts, Donald and Eric Wilson. And they drove me around town and they showed me places and they got so into the plot of the story. It was so cool. And we were trying to find the location for where my crazy cult, the Church of All Sorrows, would have their temple. And we drove around and they were like, what about this spot? What about this spot? And talking to me more and more and getting to know me, they realized, they were like, oh, we've got the perfect spot for you. And it was this amazing brutalist parking lot in Miami Beach. And I had this beautiful image of the Church of All Sorrows. And the Church of All Sorrows believe that it's God's punishment that all the men died. That we wronged the world with our feminine sins by talking too much, by not obeying our husbands. And if we just repent enough, then maybe God will forgive us and bring back the men. And they wear these ridiculous robes covered in the word sorry in like bright neon colors. It was actually inspired by Amber Rose's slut dress. You can look that up online. And it's neon print, big kind of cartoon bulbous letters. And they're the most annoying people on earth because they come up to you in public and they grab your hand and they say, do you know the word, my sister? Say it with me. The word is sorry. So it's actually a great place for Cole and Miles to hide out, because until the church begins to suspect that there's actually a boy in their midst, nobody wants to engage with them. Nobody wants to talk to them. So that was a really fun thing to play with. And finding this brutalist structure, this parking lot in the middle of Miami Beach, I just had this beautiful mental image of every layer of the parking lot filled with the sisters of the Church of All Sorrows in their neon print robes. And it was just such a lovely contrast and so fun to explore that with other people.